What if laughter, crying, and seething anger aren't just ways we express emotion, but ways in which we actually know the world? Is the idea of a dispassionate search for truth simply a lie, and that all knowledge is impassioned in some way? Conversely, what if our every mood, affect, and expression was not epistemologically innocent? In other words, that our lives consisted of suffering or enjoying a continual swarm of contradictory truths? And what if what we call consciousness was not the essence of who we are, but a mere surface effect, something that comes as a result of a deeper struggle at the level of our impulses? Enter Pierre Klossowski, novelist, translator, and philosopher whose writings on Nietzsche sought to unravel precisely this enigma. In works like Nietzsche in the Vicious Circle and the essay addressed in this video, Nietzsche, Parody, and Polytheism, Klossowski interprets Nietzsche's thought not as a rational system, but as the after-image of lived intensities, exploring how consciousness emerges from a subterranean economy of impulses. For Klossowski, pathos, or laughter, our tears, our rage, is not simply affective noise, but the very medium through which being reveals itself. Klossowski follows Nietzsche's claim in The Gay Science that consciousness was the latest function to develop in the evolution of organic life. Together, the two thinkers, Nietzsche and Klossowski, not only interrogate the belated emergence of consciousness in the human species, but critique many of its effects. Chief among these is the role of consciousness as a disruptive force, one that introduces hesitation and instability into the rhythm of impulses. Rather than grounding the self, consciousness unsettles the organism, bringing disequilibrium to both individual and species. Moreover, Nietzsche and Klossowski reject the idea that consciousness offers access to a singular, stable truth. The penchant for unity, for truth with a capital T, is incompatible with the multiplicity of impulses that constitute human life from moment to moment. Historically, the emergence of consciousness and its operations, rationality, logic, judgment, resulted from a compromise between these chaotic impulses and the emerging need for communicability, particularly within the social sphere. But this compromise comes at a cost. Consciousness is not a spontaneous illumination, but an after effect of turmoil, what Klossowski calls a supreme exhaustion. Its emotional tone reflects its origin. Calmness, sobriety, and so-called objectivity are not marks of truth, but symptoms of a depleted struggle. In valorizing itself, consciousness disavows its own genesis, detaching from the agon of impulses that gave rise to it. It forgets that clarity is only the faint echo of a deeper, prior confusion. So, if consciousness is born from exhaustion, what does that tell us about the kind of knowledge that it produces, or the limits of what it can know? Ideas like serenity, detachment, or even, in Heidegger, fundamental boredom have long been presented as privileged modes of contemplation. But this belies the fact that there exists a multiplicity of impulses: laughter, rage, desire, fear, all equally capable of apprehending existence. And if there are truths that consciousness cannot grasp, might they still be accessed through these other intensities, through modes of knowing that do not resemble thought, as we typically understand it? Perhaps it is the philosophers who understand the nature of knowledge least, or at least that's what Nietzsche suggests. Why? Because they have long mistaken consciousness, along with rationality and its modes of expression, for the foundation of human life and thought, rather than seeing it for what it is, the aftermath of a struggle. In the wake of that struggle, what remains is not clarity, but exhaustion. Or better yet, we might think of consciousness as a kind of truce or ceasefire, a temporary settlement between conflicting impulses mistaken for peace itself. Nietzsche captures this brilliantly in The Gay Science, when he rewrites Spinoza's famous dictum, not to laugh, not to cry, not to curse, but to understand. For Nietzsche, understanding is not the absence of these impulses, but what follows their internal combat. To know anything at all is to remain subject to a host of impulsive forces, we neither choose nor fully grasp. Understanding, then, is less a triumph of reason than the reverberating echo of a clash, not the domination or negation of pathos, but its residual form. This raises a deeper question. Is knowledge possible outside of or beneath the conscious, rational subject? And what might be at stake if we fail to recognize the modes of knowing native to our impulses? For both Nietzsche and Klossowski, this has everything to do with what it means to know oneself, or the world at all. Have you ever laughed uncontrollably, lashed out, or wept without knowing why, only to retroactively assign it a reasonable explanation? For Klossowski, this gap between affect and understanding becomes the very focal point of his life's work. Knowledge and communication, as he suggests, are constantly troubled by the non-communicable nature of pathos. Our impulses, so often pathologized in clinical terms, resist the forms of knowledge familiar to a world that privileges consciousness. And yet, they may be the most faithful witnesses of who we are. And here we arrive at Klossowski's conception of pathetic knowledge. Not pathetic in the derogatory sense, but in the sense that all knowledge is marked by partiality, rooted in the pathos from which it arises. One way to think about this, especially in connection with figures we have explored on Left Hand, and you can navigate to select videos or discussions in the show notes, is that this partisan nature of knowledge implies it is bound up with an image, often a symbolic or mythic figure, a god or divine type, through which an impulse seeks its form. As Klossowski puts it, existence seeks a physiognomy in order to reveal itself. The actor is its medium. What reveals existence? A possible physiognomy, perhaps that of a god. We should be cautious, however, not to take this too literally or mythologically. Rather, he's showing how impulses, drives, affects, intensities appear as figures or masks in the moment they become legible to consciousness. Each impulse has its own image, so to speak, that it must abandon as it reaches the light of consciousness and enters into the representations familiar to language. Or, as we might put it, each impulse is born with an image, but must shed it in order to enter the light of consciousness, where it becomes misrecognized as thought. What if our thoughts, especially the conceited ideal of objectivity, are not revelations of truth, but symptoms of exhaustion? What if what we take for clarity is merely the calm that follows a storm of impulses, a truce misread as a kind of insight? We imagine ourselves as the authors of our thought, but Klossowski suggests otherwise. We are used by a necessity unknown to us. We appear, even to ourselves, as chance eruptions, but what erupts is already shaped by a deeper, obscured necessity, one that expresses itself not in reason, but in the singularity of each of our impulses. What do you think? Can a tear or laughter reveal something no concept could ever do? Is it possible that our most irrational moments are also the most truthful? Thank you for watching this installment of Left Hand. If you enjoyed this video, you can check the show notes for links to related episodes, source texts, and ways to support the podcast, whether through Patreon, sharing the show, or just continuing the conversation elsewhere. Until next time, may your contradictions speak clearly and your pathos no more than your reason.